The doctor had felt more pressure than usual. Bryce raised his eyebrows questioningly, and the doctor said, "She's fine. When she wakes up, she'll be as good as new." The doctor took off his mask and smiled. Bryce nodded. He didn't notice that his body had immediately relaxed upon hearing what the doctor said. He said, "Okay, I get it. I'll wait here." A hint of surprise flashed across the doctor's eyes, but he didn't dare contradict Bryce. Instead, he said, "She won't wake up until tomorrow morning. I can see that you are looking very tired. Would it not be better if perhaps you went home to rest?" Bryce didn't say anything. He looked at the doctor stonily. The doctor, not daring to say anything else, turned and left. Bryce went into the ward where Natalie had been admitted. There was a strong smell of disinfectant everywhere, and he frowned in disgust. Ugh, he hated that smell. But when he saw the pale, frail figure on the bed, he stopped in his tracks. There were tears in the lashes of Natalie's closed eyes. He thought about all that she had suffered that night and felt a pang in his chest. His heart suddenly lurched, as if a pair of invisible hands had gripped it, and he felt lightheaded for a second. This was the true meaning of heartache, right? He shook his head in disbelief. Seeing Natalie in such a weak and pitiful state, he felt his anger rising. Howard had dared to hurt this woman. He must be taught a lesson he would never forget. He would show Howard that he couldn't act in this way and get away with it. Bryce sat down by the bed and fell into an uneasy doze. Natalie, who was sleeping, didn't know that Bryce was beside her. Her body was no longer in pain, but her mind was still in chaos, and she dreamed vivid and frightening dreams. The night passed, and the next morning she slowly woke up. By that time, she had slept for 12 hours straight. She opened her eyes and saw that she was in pure white surroundings. Before she could get used to the light, partial confused memories from last night flooded into her mind. She anxiously lifted the coverlet and looked at herself. Her clothes were still on her. Well, that was good. She remembered that Howard had been pawing at her clothes last night. Then, as she looked more closely, she realized that what she was wearing was clearly a hospital gown. Was she in the hospital? Natalie looked around and saw Bryce sitting beside her bed, staring at her with a strange look on his tired face. Bryce's haggard face and bloodshot eyes seemed to indicate that he had not rested much the entire night. Natalie said in surprise, "Bryce, what are you doing here?" She tried to recall what happened last night. She could only recall as far as looking around the hotel room for an escape route, and then Howard appeared. After that, it was all blank. Her face turned even paler, and she asked, "How did I get to the hospital?" "Have you forgotten?" A complex expression passed across Bryce's face, but disappeared very quickly. Natalie tried to recall again, but there she couldn't remember anything. She shook her head and said, "I have no memory of this place, or of how I got here." She suddenly had a horrible thought about what might have happened after Howard closed in on her. Natalie trembled and said, "Oh my God,
Ano i-chat
could
ko?
it be that Howard..." Seeing the panic on Natalie's face, Bryce shook his head and reassured her, saying, "Don't worry, you're fine now. Nothing happened to you. Nothing serious, nothing physical. You're my wife. I won't let anything happen to you." Natalie felt relieved. She asked falteringly, "Did you save me last night?" She suddenly recalled a hazy impression of someone else coming into the room while Howard was menacing her. Bryce wanted to say that it had been him, but when the words reached his lips, he said, "It was Samuel. Samuel found you and saved you." Natalie let out a sigh of relief. Although her body was still weak, she could feel that she wasn't badly hurt. Then, thinking about what happened last night, Natalie became furious, clenching her fists. Howard had almost succeeded in getting what he wanted. She remembered shouting, "Bastard!" and she wanted to shout it again now. She would remember what Howard had done forever, and she would remember Ellington standing next to him in the grand hall, smirking. She wouldn't forget or forgive. Bryce interrupted her thoughts, saying, "So, how do you feel now?" His tone was calm and measured, his usual distant voice. Natalie couldn't help but find Bryce's cold expression funny. He was so awkward, even when he was trying to be caring. She said, "I think I'm okay." "Yes, I think so. Thank you for taking care of me. Really." Bryce responded with a faint, Then he said briskly, "Remember not to drink so much next time you go out. You don't have good alcohol capacity. You might not be so lucky next time." Natalie's face fell. She couldn't help but feel resentment. She said huffily, "Of course I know that. But it wasn't my fault. I was drugged last night. My God, I won't let Howard get away with this. My God." On hearing Howard's name, Bryce lowered his eyes to hide his burning anger. Natalie wanted to ask Bryce if he knew Howard. Even though Star Entertainment wasn't a very big company, not like Bryce's corporations, they both had the surname Claire. Wasn't that too much of a coincidence? But before she could ask, Bryce had already stood up. He looked at her blandly and said, "Have a good rest. Don't go to work today. Liam and Mrs. Perkins will come over to see you later. I have things to do." "Oh, okay," Natalie acknowledged. Before Bryce could leave, she added, "You've watched over me all night. Thank you again." Bryce paused slightly, then turned and left. Natalie was not a fool. Seeing Bryce in such a haggard state, she guessed that he must have sat by her bed the whole night. It was impossible for her not to be moved. On the contrary, she felt warm gratitude spreading through her. Thinking about this, Natalie smiled. Although Bryce always played it cool, deep down he was a good man. While she was still thinking about him, her phone, which was on the nightstand by the bed, rang. She picked it up and saw Tony Bavel's number on the caller ID. She picked up and Tony blurted out, "Natalie, where are you? Are you all right? Why weren't you answering the phone? I'm about to die from anxiety." Last night, after Bryce and Samuel had left him in the hallway, Tony had looked for Natalie for a while, but had heard nothing more about her. He'd been worried the whole night, and he would have called the police this morning if Natalie still hadn't picked up the phone. Natalie's heart warmed to Tony as she told him, "Tony, I'm sorry. I was drunk last night, so I came home. I forgot to tell you. Don't worry." She was truly moved by the concern of the people around her. Tony heaved a sigh of relief. Hearing Natalie's unusually weak voice, he still couldn't stop worrying and asked, "Natalie, are you okay? Your voice sounds weird." Natalie thought for a moment and decided not to tell Tony the truth about what had happened. She laughed and said, "It's nothing, Tony. Just a hangover." Tony finally believed her. Then he recalled something else about last night and said, "Oh, Natalie, there's another thing. I heard that Howard Clare was arrested and taken to the police station last night. He seems to have been involved in something, but I don't know what. Do you know what happened?" Natalie was stunned for a moment. Then she recovered and said, "No, I have no idea. How intriguing." After saying goodbye to Tony, she hurriedly hung up the phone. She was astonished to find out that Howard had been arrested. Was that also Samuel's work? Natalie thought that the next time she saw Samuel, she must thank him. Big time. If it hadn't been for Samuel, Natalie didn't dare to imagine what could have happened last night. Howard's evil face was still lingering in her mind. She shuddered. It seemed like she had to watch out for those two villains, Howard Clare and Mark Ellington, in the future. Not long after Tony's call, Natalie fell asleep again. When she awoke, Liam and Mrs. Perkins were sitting by her bed. "Mommy, you're finally awake! Yay!" Natalie opened her eyes and saw Liam's tear-stained face. She struggled to sit up and take Liam in her arms, saying, "Oh, dear Liam, what's wrong? Why are you crying? Mommy's here. Mommy's fine." She quickly comforted him. Her heart ached when she saw him cry. Liam leaned against her and looked at her with tears still streaming down his face. "You finally woke up. I was really scared." Meanwhile, Mrs. Perkins' anxious heart finally started to calm. She looked at Natalie benevolently and said, "Mrs. Clare, it's so good to see you awake. What happened to you last night?" Mrs. Perkins had known that something wrong had happened, but she was skeptical if Natalie would tell her the truth. Will she be able to find out the truth? Or will Natalie shroud the reality with another lie?
You think this episode could have ended in a better way? We know you do. Start your own audio series and hit the top of the charts.
Natalie thought for a moment and said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Perkins. I just had a little too much to drink and made myself ill. I'm sorry I made you worry. She didn't want to talk about the drugging or any of the other stuff for the time being. Mrs. Perkins nodded with relief and said, You young people can't control yourselves when you drink sometimes. Well, Liam and I were very worried. Please don't drink like that anymore. She didn't force her to spill the truth and accepted whatever Natalie had said. Natalie nodded her head. Her alcohol tolerance had always been low. She definitely wouldn't drink so much ever again. By the time the afternoon came, she was ready to leave the hospital. She remembered that she had an appointment with Optimal magazine, the photo shoot for Tony. She didn't want to be late. Mrs. Perkins tried to stop her from going to work, but this was in vain, as her attitude was firm. She asked Mrs. Perkins to look after Liam, then left the hospital. Seeing that it was getting late, Natalie texted Tony the address and said she'd meet him there. Then she rushed to the location. Meanwhile, Mark Ellington was beside himself with worry after he heard that Howard had been taken to jail. He hadn't expected that anyone would be brave enough to have Howard arrested. Howard was a Clare, and the Clares was a rich and influential family, and had many friends and contacts in City Hall and elsewhere in positions of authority. Ellington knew that he was implicated in what Howard had done. Thinking about this, his anxiety levels had gone through the roof. Not knowing what else to do, he rushed nervously to the jail to see Howard. Just as he parked his car outside, he saw Howard emerging from the building's front entrance. He grew even more nervous, but he bit the bullet and approached Howard, asking, Howard, are you okay? Howard's expression was dark. Thinking about what happened last night, he snapped, How can I be okay? I've been in a jail all night. If it wasn't for my grandpa getting the family lawyer to bail me, I would still be in a cell. He looked at Ellington, and his anger boiled over. He shouted, How could you screw this up so badly? Ellington was on the verge of tears as he said, Howard, I don't know what happened. Whoever did this to you certainly has got a lot of nerve. Howard was also puzzled about how he had been thwarted, and he was afraid that news of this matter had reached Bryce's ears. The two did not have a good relationship in any case, and there was a Clare family gathering scheduled for the near future. If Howard created trouble that reflected badly on the Clare family, Bryce would be furious. Things were not going to be easy for Howard. He softened and said, Look, Mark, forget it. I can't really blame you for this. Where is that woman, Natalie? The tension eased a little. Ellington was relieved and hurriedly replied, She didn't come to the office today, but I heard she went to shoot a magazine cover with Tony Bobble. Howard replied with a faint, Huh, and a mysterious expression flitted across his face. He pondered for a moment before finally shaking his head and saying, Forget about her for now. I'll have plenty of time for her later. Ellington nodded doubtfully. It seemed that Natalie wasn't as easy to deal with as Howard had thought. Meanwhile, Natalie and Tony had arrived at the studio. The photographer from the magazine was already waiting outside. When he saw them coming, he hurried over and greeted them enthusiastically. Natalie, Tony, hi! Good to see you again. The photographer was one of the top people in the industry. He was especially enthusiastic about this shoot because he knew that Tony's popularity was soaring. Natalie responded with a faint, but her expression was cold. Tony, on the other hand, seemed a bit shy and distracted, maybe nervous about the photo shoot. Inside, as the assistants prepared the sets, the photographer explained the photo shoot concept. Okay, because this is for a gourmet magazine, we're using gourmet food as the theme. And we're going to use a historical theme, too, to evoke the French royal court of the pre-revolutionary France. You know, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, the 18th century, powder and wigs, all that. Okay? Natalie and Tony looked at each other and shrugged. She said, Sure, why not? The photographer said, Cool. We've got some other models to work with, Tony, and all sorts of costumes and props to get the period atmosphere right. We'll be using the core idea of a kind of banquet at Louis and Marie Antoinette's Palace of Versailles. A makeup artist arrived and quickly got to work on Tony, transforming his appearance into that of the 18th century French king. Tony's features looked good under the pale makeup and the powdered wig. A female model played the role of Marie Antoinette. She and Tony were to be photographed eating a series of complicated foodstuffs typical of the French royal court. The photographer's assistants worked quickly and efficiently, and everything was soon made ready. Natalie moved to the side, indicating that the photographer could start shooting. But for some reason, she had a feeling that Tony wasn't at his best today. Tony's temperament was of the more melancholy kind, and she wondered whether he would be able to convincingly portray a powerful, carefree king at this banqueting table. Sure enough, Tony was unable to get into the mood of the shoot, no matter how many times he tried. Moreover, he and the female model he was working with couldn't come to a good understanding, making Tony feel even more uncomfortable. The photographer grew impatient and short-tempered, and Tony's face gradually assumed a dejected look. Eventually, the photographer said, "Look, let's take a break. Everyone is obviously tired." He sighed deeply, then hurried across to Natalie's side and complained, "Natalie, what's wrong here? Can you think of anything to get Tony to perform? We're on a tight schedule here. We need to get this done." The photographer looked at his watch pointedly. There wasn't much time left. If Tony didn't get his act together, the photographer would have to tell the magazine's editor to get another cover star. Natalie knew that Tony couldn't continue like this. She reassured the photographer and walked straight over to Tony and said, "Tony, can we talk privately for a moment?" She kept a neutral expression on her face. Tony thought Natalie was going to reprimand him, so he said apologetically, "Natalie, I'm sorry. I've let you down." "Cut the crap," said Natalie harshly. "Just follow me." Natalie was a little anxious and didn't want to hear his apology. She led Tony into the changing room. She gestured to the royal costume he was wearing and said, "Take off that outfit." Tony was a little confused, but he took off the clothes, cowed by her serious expression. Pushing Tony onto a chair, she said to the makeup artist, "Make him up as Marie Antoinette. Hurry up." The makeup artist nodded, a faint smile on her face. Tony sat obediently and listened to her instructions. At the same time, he couldn't help but be confused about his new character makeup. He looked at the Marie Antoinette gown that he would have to put on and frowned. When Tony's makeup was finished, to Natalie's satisfaction, and a ringleted wig put on his head after he donned the gown, she sat herself down at the dressing table and said to the makeup artist, "Now make me up as King Louis XVI." Just then the photographer walked in, wondering where Tony had got to. When he saw how Tony was dressed and the makeup on his and Natalie's faces, he was momentarily perplexed. He said, Natalie, what?" As Natalie put on the king's costume, she explained, "To make this work, we need to reverse the roles." The photographer looked dubious. If the advertising campaign was ruined, his boss would blame him, and he couldn't afford that. He said nervously, "Are you sure this is okay? I don't think I can make this decision. The magazine," Natalie said curtly, "if you're worried, go ask the editor." The photographer nodded and went to call the editor. Natalie had pretty much finished dressing herself, so she said to Tony, "Tony, just cooperate with me here and don't waste any more time. We need to take advantage of this opportunity any which way we can." When Tony saw Natalie's determined expression, he knew he couldn't refuse. He was like a lost soul who had finally found a guide. Subconsciously, Tony always felt that Natalie could help him. The photographer returned, frowning. He glanced at Natalie and said, "The editor has agreed." She didn't seem too surprised. She said to the photographer, "Good. We're good to go. We can restart the shoot now." When everything was ready, the photographer was going to say a few more words to her because she wasn't a professional actor after all. But she said, "There's no need to say anything. Let's begin." Seeing that the photographer was still worried, she added, "Just relax. I guarantee that this will work." The photographer shrugged doubtfully, annoyed that things seemed to be spiraling out of his control, but he didn't say anything more. He ordered his assistants to get into position and set up the cameras and lights. "Get into position, everyone. Let's begin." With everything prepared, Natalie picked up a small pastry from the table and pulled Tony over to her. She sat him down on the edge of the table and leaned over him, looking at him tenderly. Natalie held the pastry close to Tony's face, a charming smile on her face. Her performance was just right. When the photographer saw Natalie's pose and expression, he was impressed. She was as good as a professional actor. Tony seemed to have been transformed as well. But panic still flashed across his face, as if he wanted to say something, but was embarrassed.
An empty land.
The photographer's eyes lit up, and he pressed the shutter to capture this perfect moment. They worked through a few similar poses, all of which worked well, and which the photographer found convincing. In the end, the photographer was very happy with the shoot. He could not help but marvel at the synergy between Natalie and Tony. If he hadn't known any different, he would have thought that they had rehearsed this kind of scene many times before. After the photo shoot was done, the photographer rechecked the images and nodded with satisfaction. He walked over to Tony and Natalie and said, "You guys did great. I think the editor is going to be very happy. Good job." Natalie was tired, so she could only nod and said, "That's good. Thank you." Tony lowered his head shyly. He was thinking about Natalie's face during the photo shoot and how it had been full of ruthlessness and charm. The photographer left the studio happily, thinking that he would like to work with these two models again sometime. By the time the photo shoot had been wrapped up, it was already 10 p.m. The crew packed up their equipment and left. Natalie and Tony prepared to leave together. She was ready to talk to him about the problems they had encountered today. He felt a bit awkward. He kept his head down and walked silently. He looked embarrassed and was blushing. She looked at him and teased, "Tony, you're such an innocent guy. Tell me the truth, have you ever even held a woman's hand?" Tony's face turned even redder as he glanced at her with embarrassment and said, "Natalie, please stop teasing me." Natalie was amused by Tony's indignance and innocence. It was actually pretty cute. And it was rare to be able to remain so innocent when you were in the big dung heap of the entertainment industry. They joked around for a while Lee decided to send Tony home. But he said he wanted to go to the hospital, so they called a cab to take them both there. When they got there, Gina was already asleep. Natalie hurriedly glanced at the sleeping girl before returning home. Back at the Clare mansion, she found that Mrs. Perkins was still awake. It seemed that she had been waiting for Natalie downstairs. Natalie wondered why Mrs. Perkins was waiting for her. Did she find out the truth, or did something else await Natalie? Mrs. Perkins quickly asked, "Mrs. Clare, why are you back so late? Are you hungry? I'll make you some food." Natalie was moved by Mrs. Perkins' concern. She said slowly, "Mrs. Perkins, I've already eaten. There's no need to wait up for me when I'm late. You have to look after yourself." Mrs. Perkins looked flattered and said, "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm too old to need much sleep." She thought that not only was Mrs. Clare nice, she did not have the slightest bit of arrogance when she talked to the house helps. She sighed inwardly at Bryce's good taste. Natalie was tired. She asked absently, "Mrs. Perkins, where's Liam?" "Liam is upstairs in Mr. Clare's room, preparing to sleep," Mrs. Perkins said with a smile. She remembered that Bryce had accepted Liam's request to sleep in his bedroom. This made her happy. She had watched Bryce grow up, and from a young age, he had loved to be clean and separate from other people to a much higher degree than other people. Ever since adolescence, he had lived by himself. Even his mother had rarely gone to his room. She hadn't expected that Bryce would change so much in response to Liam and Natalie coming to live in the house. Natalie walked upstairs to the door of Bryce's room. She knew about Bryce's moods, and she couldn't quite believe that Liam was in his room. The door was not closed tightly, and through the small crack, she saw Liam laying on Bryce's bed. Bryce was reading him a story. She stood at the door and listened to Bryce's deep voice. It made her feel slightly numb. For a moment, she felt as if what she was seeing wasn't real. She'd originally meant to take a quick look before returning to her room, so as to avoid disturbing them, but now she found that she was reluctant to move. She stood in the doorway for a long time. After a while, Liam spotted Natalie. He immediately got up and shouted, "Mommy, you're here!" Her face turned red. She felt extremely embarrassed to have been discovered watching them. Natalie braced herself and entered the room, going to sit beside Liam. She surreptitiously observed Bryce's reaction. He only glanced at her indifferently, just like he always did. She let out a sigh of relief. Seeing that it was getting late, she said to Bryce, "Thank you for looking after Liam tonight, but it's getting late, so I'll take him and go back to rest." Then she looked at Liam and said, Come on, Liam, let's go to my room. I'll read you a story and then we'll sleep. But Liam, who was normally so obedient, decided to disagree with her. He looked at her with tears in his eyes and said, "No, no, Mommy. I want to be with Dad." Liam's simple words made Natalie gasp. An image of her and Bryce lying on the same bed suddenly appeared in her mind, and she didn't dare to catch Bryce's eye. She said, "Listen, Liam, Dad has to work tomorrow, so let's not disturb him. Come with me." She tried to pull Liam up from the bed. Thinking about the image of her and Bryce lying down together, she became more determined and picked Liam up from the bed. Liam looked at her with tears in his eyes. He looked upset and wailed, "Mommy, don't make me go!" Her heart suddenly softened, but then she told herself that sleeping here would be really inappropriate, so she could only harden her heart and say, "Liam, please can you do what I ask you?" But Liam only shook his head and grabbed hold of Bryce's sleeve. He refused to let go. He couldn't bear to leave Bryce. Natalie sighed helplessly. She looked pleadingly at Bryce and saw that his eyes were lit up with an amused smile. When Natalie looked at him, he took Liam's small hand in his own. Bryce said to Liam, "Go to sleep, Liam. Right here." Liam laughed out loud, and the look of upset vanished from his face. Natalie's heart almost melted as she saw Liam like this. As long as Liam was happy, she didn't care about anything else. With that thought in mind, she moved to the bed and lay down next to Liam. She felt Bryce's gaze on her and didn't dare to look at him. Liam was very happy to be lying in the middle between his mom and dad. He didn't know whose hand to hold. He was very excited. Natalie took the storybook from Bryce and said to Liam, "Okay, it's getting late. I'll read you a story and then you can sleep, okay?" Liam finally stopped messing around and went to sleep without her noticing. In the end, she herself fell asleep while she was reading. Bryce looked at the sleeping mother and child and smiled. Then he simply closed his eyes and fell asleep himself. This was the first time the three of them had slept together as a family. The next morning, when Mrs. Perkins got up, she passed by Bryce's room and saw Natalie, Liam, and Bryce asleep in a row on the bed. The warm family scene made her smile. She was delighted to see them all together like that. Previously, Bryce and Natalie had been distant from each other, and she was worried that there was a problem with their relationship. But now it seemed to her that maybe she had been worrying unnecessarily. She was so happy to see Mr. and Mrs. Clare together. Little did she know about the arrangement Bryce and Natalie had made. But what will happen when the truth about their relationship comes out in the open? Will Mrs. Perkins treat Natalie with similar love and respect, or will her attitude toward her change? Just as Mrs. Perkins was watching, Liam woke up. He was immediately in high spirits, even though it was still early in the morning. He looked at his sleeping parents with delight. Seeing that Liam had woken up, Mrs. Perkins immediately whispered to him to come with her and let the two adults sleep for a while. He and Mrs. Perkins left quietly. Natalie woke up at 9 a.m. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was Bryce's sleeping face. He had rolled quite close to her, and she could smell the tobacco scent of his cigarettes on him. She stared blankly at the sleeping figure in front of her. Just then, Bryce also opened his eyes. When their eyes met, neither of them looked away. They stayed like that for a while in the quiet bedroom, with the light coming in from the window over the bed, just looking at each other. They could hear each other's breathing. Somehow this strange moment of their being together felt both natural and yet uncomfortable. It was as if neither of them knew what to do or say to break the spell of the moment. Bryce lifted his arm from where it was lying across his chest and started to gently reach toward Natalie, as if he were going to touch her hair. Then something seemed to change in Bryce, and a darker expression came into his face. The soft light went out of his eyes, and his glance hardened. He withdrew his hand. He had realized that his softer feelings were coming to the surface, and he knew that he had to suppress them. He said clumsily, and more roughly than he had intended, "Aren't you going to get up?" Natalie's face flushed. She immediately got up and scrambled to the bathroom, wishing that she never had to come out again after closing the door. Bryce slowly sat up. There was a puzzled look and a hint of disbelief in his eyes now. Did he actually have feelings for Natalie? He looked towards the bathroom door and frowned. Natalie took a cold shower to clear her head. When she emerged from the bathroom, she didn't look at Bryce. She looked at the ground guiltily instead, as she made for the hallway. Downstairs, Mrs. Perkins had already prepared breakfast. When Bryce arrived, they all sat around the table to eat. The atmosphere was awkward and silent. Natalie was still immersed in the embarrassing scene with Bryce from earlier that morning. Bryce ate in silence and avoided her eyes. Mrs. Perkins thought back to the scene earlier when the family was all lying on the bed together that morning. She said cautiously, "Mr. Clare, I would like to ask you something." Bryce shrugged, his mouth full of coffee, so Mrs. Perkins continued, "Sir, you're married to Mrs. Clare now. I was wondering." Here she paused, a little afraid to go on. "And I was wondering if your mother knows about this marriage." A prime reason why Mrs. Perkins had been in the Clare family for so many years was her loyalty to Bryce's mother. Therefore, she couldn't help but think if his mother knew about the marriage, and if she did, what she thought about it. Natalie glanced at Bryce. She had met his mother before, and she felt that the woman was dignified, noble, and elegant. She was also a very polite woman. But if she found out that her son had married a woman who had a child, what would she think? Thinking of this, Natalie could not help but feel dejected. Bryce said indifferently, "We were in a hurry when we got married. We'll announce it to the family when we find a suitable time." Seeing Bryce's attitude, Mrs. Perkins did not say anything more. After all, she was just a house help, and Mr. Clare must have his own plans. But when she noticed Liam sitting at the table, eating obediently, she suddenly had second thoughts. She remembered that a short while ago, Liam had been bullied by other children at school. Her heart ached, and she could not help but exclaim, "Liam is a Clare. If people had known that he was a Clare earlier, then he wouldn't have been bullied." Bryce and Natalie were taken aback by this. They looked at each other but didn't say anything. Mrs. Perkins didn't know the truth about the relationship between them. She thought that Liam was Bryce's own child, especially given Liam's intelligence and his resemblance to the young Bryce that she remembered. However, she could only keep quiet. Anyone with a discerning eye could tell that although Bryce and Natalie were husband and wife, they weren't like an ordinary couple. It was strange. After breakfast, Natalie needed to go to work, so she handed Liam over to Mrs. Perkins. She always felt at ease when she left Liam in Mrs. Perkins' care. Natalie got into Bryce's car and he drove her over to her office. They didn't talk much along the way, but eventually, Natalie asked him tentatively, "If your family knew you were married, what do you think they would say?" Bryce gave Natalie a confused look and said, "You don't need to worry about it." Natalie nodded and didn't say anything else. She didn't want to get involved with any family politics of the Clare family. She said, "Well, if you ever need me to do anything in the text or need my help," to his dominant characteristics, responded, dropped Natalie off near her office and left. Natalie couldn't help but sigh. This man was truly cold when it came to everything he did, but in a way, this was also a good thing. She didn't want to owe Bryce too much. She was afraid that she wouldn't be able to repay him in the future. How would Bryce's family react when they get to know about his marriage? Will the Clares accept Natalie and Liam readily, or will they face abandonment once again?
You think this episode have ended in a better way? We know you do. Start your audio series and hit the top of the charts.
Natalie had just arrived at work when she heard that Howard had been released from the police custody. The gossip about Howard being arrested the night before was spreading fast all around the company. She talked to a few people, fishing to see how much they knew, but no one seemed to be aware of why he had really been arrested. It seemed that Howard, knowing he had been in the wrong, was trying to suppress the matter. She was relieved. She didn't want to be embarrassed in front of the whole company because of him. The morning was peaceful and quiet. She was worried that Howard would come and cause trouble, but he didn't make an appearance. She was thinking that if he dared to come, she would hit him so hard that he wouldn't be able to speak. He had dared to plot against her using such despicable methods. It was shameless. It was disgusting. While she was thinking about this, she received a phone call. It was an unfamiliar number. She picked up and said, "Hello, this is Natalie Davidson." A young woman on the other end of the line said in a clear voice, "Hello, I understand that you were trying to recruit an assistant. Can I apply for the role?" She was a little taken aback. In her ads, she had specified experience as the prime criteria to apply for the position of her assistant, but this voice on the phone sounded like it belonged to a teenager. Natalie said, "We're looking for an experienced assistant. How old are you?" "I'm 21 years old this year. Is that okay?" the caller said sweetly. She thought that a 21-year-old was simply too young, so she sounded skeptical as she said, "Why don't you come over to the office for an interview?" The girl on the phone seemed very excited and said immediately, Okay, I'll be right there," before hanging up. She thought for a moment and decided to call Tony and have him come to the office to assess the assistant himself. In response to Natalie's call, Tony rushed to her office. He'd been in the practice room training, and his sweatshirt was damp with sweat. "Tony," said Natalie, "I've maybe found an assistant. From now on, there'll be more work to do, and I can't do it alone. The potential assistant is coming for an interview later. If you're satisfied with her, she can get the job." Tony nodded, his face full of gratitude. Natalie really looked out for him. He could tell. Since the candidate wouldn't arrive for a while, Natalie started to busy herself with other tasks. She logged on to social media first. She wanted to see what was trending recently. But the first thing she saw was Tony's social media pages. She took a closer look. There was stuff there about the photos of Tony dressed as Marie Antoinette. The magazine's official social media account had posted a few of the photos as a promotional post after the shoot the previous day. Tony's fans had seen these photos and spread them around with lots of comments. Since then, the posts had appeared in lots of popular searches. She browsed through some of the comments and found them quite interesting. "Tony looks too beautiful when he plays the part of a woman. He was once a male god, but now he's my goddess. Young Tony is so handsome, so sweet. He's simply perfect. I'm going to marry him. All right, I saw it in the magazine. I admit I have become a fan." Along with these comments, Tony's social media fan count had increased by another large amount. Natalie rejoiced. Her plan had only been to make the magazine happy, but she hadn't expected all this social media excitement as well. This could be considered an unexpected gain. Soon after, she found another trending subject on the search engine, the new king. She was stunned. This seemed to be related to her playing the part of King Louis in the shoot. She clicked through to the stories, and the comments made her blush. I'm so jealous of that person who teased my Tony. Return my male god. That king looks really good. Who is he? I'd like to get to know him. Is he a new actor on the block?" Seeing all these comments about her, she was really speechless. She hadn't expected to become famous herself while she was working with Tony. The official social media platform for Optimal Magazine was about to explode. The number of users there had risen massively, many of them asking about the real identity of the king in the pictures. Coincidentally, at that moment, the editor of the magazine, Laura Kalis, phoned. When Natalie answered, Laura said, "Hello, Natalie. I'm sure you've seen the explosion on social media. Thanks to your creativity, we're going viral. I would like to thank you on behalf of the magazine." Then she continued, "And I'd like to ask you if we can announce your identity as the king and make the dreams of the fans come true." Natalie thought about it for a while, feeling troubled. She actually wanted to keep a low profile. After all, she wasn't a celebrity. But then she thought about how in this industry, with all the internet coverage, no one would be able to keep themselves hidden for long. She might as well let it be revealed sooner rather than later. Natalie said, "Sure, Laura, why not? Publish it." The magazine moved very quickly. Not long after Laura hung up, the Optimal website announced that the king was none other than Natalie Davidson, Tony Bavil's agent. This news prompted another social media explosion. So the king is a woman? Isn't she too beautiful? Yeah, I thought it was a very handsome guy. Her disguise as a man was too successful. I liked him. I don't care. I'm in love with the king. I want to marry him. Next, the number of Natalie's personal social media followers also soared. Quite a few people posted, urging her to become a celebrity as well, urging that it would help her in her role as an agent to the stars. Natalie was amused when she saw all the comments on social media. She suddenly felt that the fans on social media were quite adorable. However, she would have to think carefully before becoming a celebrity. If she became one, it might be easier for her to help Tony in the future, but she shouldn't make any decision in a hurry. Meanwhile, Bryce was in his office dealing with matters related to his companies. There was an icy look in his cold eyes, the look that made people feel that this man was as immovable as a mountain. No one would dare to disturb him when he looked like that. But just then, someone hurried in, not even bothering to knock on the door. Samuel. He was probably the only person who was not intimidated by him. Before Samuel had even sat down, he took out his phone and showed the screen to him, saying, "Bryce, look, this is your wife, right?" Bryce was busy and didn't have time for Samuel right now. He didn't even look at him before coldly shouting, "Get out!" Samuel didn't move. He said, "Come on, take a quick look, Bryce. This is mega popular on the internet." Bryce usually didn't care much about such things in the internet and entertainment worlds, but Samuel's irritating presence had already disturbed him, so he took a look at his friend's phone screen. Seeing the person in the photo of King Louis and Marie Antoinette displayed there, he immediately frowned and raised his eyebrows and glanced at Samuel. The person in the photo was indeed Natalie. Sensing Bryce's gaze, he started to feel uncomfortable. When he'd seen this photo, he'd been very surprised himself. He wanted to see Bryce's expression, so he'd hurried over. But Bryce didn't seem to be very angry. Samuel was puzzled. What was in the nature of Bryce's and Natalie's relationship? Wasn't it natural for a husband to be upset when he saw his wife messing around with another guy like this? He said, "You seem pretty unmoved by this." Bryce looked coldly at Samuel. The expression on his face was indeed neutral, but deep within he was feeling very unhappy. He thought back to the scene in the photo. Why hadn't Natalie discussed this with him? Samuel said, "I can't imagine Vivian getting involved with anything like this. Maybe she would have been a better match for you after all." Bryce's mind was occupied by the scene between Natalie and the actor, so he wasn't in the mood to listen to Samuel's chatter. He kicked him out of his office in annoyance. On the way out, Samuel was somehow pleased that he had managed to get a reaction from Bryce for once. He'd managed to cut through his cold armor. It appeared to him that Bryce's relationship with Natalie was really not simple at all. After Samuel left, Bryce couldn't help but recall lying on the bed looking at Natalie that morning. And then, as he thought of her posing for pictures with other men, he felt unhappy. Bryce, unaware of how angry and upset he looked after thinking about that, called his assistant in. When the assistant came in and saw his boss's expression, he was surprised. What was going on with Bryce today? The assistant asked carefully, "Mr. Clare, do you have any requirements? Is there anything special I can help you with today?" Bryce took out a file from his drawer and gave it to the assistant, but his expression didn't change much as he said, "Add a clause to this contract, stipulating that in the future the female party in the contract is not to pose for pictures with other men." The assistant took the document. When he saw the existing terms of the contract, he was stunned. He looked at Bryce in surprise, unable to say anything as he thought, "Boss is married? I can't believe it." However, the assistant could only reply respectfully, "Okay." Then he took the papers away. However, he couldn't help but be curious about what kind of woman would be able to make his boss fall in love. After the assistant had dealt with the terms of the contract, he emailed a copy to Natalie as Bryce had instructed. Natalie was in her office dealing with some other matters when the email arrived. Seeing the new terms of the engagement in the revised contract, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Social media was so busy, so ubiquitous, so it wasn't really a surprise that Bryce already knew about the photos. But Bryce's response to them? That she had definitely not expected. She thought that she needed to explain things to him, so she immediately dialed his number. Bryce answered quickly, but his tone...
Copy, madam. Thank you. Starfish. 3-4 na ano. Your followers, your subscribers, only 136. Bigyan ka ng 4. Aglet. Sambilin. Betty ka ba, Samba? Aliyah. Yan ha. Ano ang pangalan mo? Merce Madayos. Hello. Search ko na lang. Bigyan kita dito. Merce. Madayos. Ayun. Paano Madayos? Ayun ha. Yan ha. Bigyan ka ng ano. Tangas del Taalog Balbia de Robia. 1. 1 na ha. 1 bananas. Tanawan, Batangas. Nine. Ayun na. Pinanood ko yung ano. Oh. Seven. 38 na. Wait. Hmm. 38, 39. Ayan, 40. O, anong gagawin ko? Hatid kita? Hatid kita? Yeah. Mag-ano ka muna? Nag-aaral. Bata pa yan, 15 pa lang. Grade 10 pa lang yun. Punta ka sa ibang sa ibang mga live. Tulad ng kay Lela Quachera pag alauna. Makakakuha ka ng dun, subscriber. Bigyan ka nun ng dami dyan nagbibigay ng Ako nga dati 8 lang. Ngayon baga 2,000 mahigit na. Pati kay yung Rebecca Padua, pumunta ka. Ako nga dati, wala pa rin. Bago pa lang ako eh. Halos ilang buwan pa nga lang ako na nag-ano pa akong watch hour. Konti pa lang watch hour ko. Ngayon pa nga lang ako nakakapag live ng diretso. Yan. Yan ka na. Konti pa lang mo. Konti pa lang ko. Oh, nagbaba yung ko. Arts. Tama. Konti pa. Ang watch hour na lang. Ano? 3 buwan. 3 months lang. Ngayon lang naman ako nagdire-diretso. Dati di ko man iniintindihan. Di man ako marunong yan. Hatid ko muna sa kapilya yung anak ko. Nagmasid ako. Susi. Be! Nakagaya ka na? Ganun, Be. Ito bang ano? Maaga pa? Bahala ka. Maaga pa pala. Wait lang pa. Sige. Pero mag-start ka na mag-live para yung watch hour. Para bago mo ma-reach yung ano. Bago mo maano yung 3,000 ano. Mag-live ka na. Mura kini. Kenya. Kenya, Kenya. Oh, 62 na lang. 62 na. Dami.
Announce their marriage in the future, he would lose face. So she explained patiently, do you know that in that photo I'm in a character, right? It's not me who is interacting with the other person, but the character I'm portraying. She had been in the entertainment industry abroad for so many years, so of course she knew the nitty-gritty of these. Natalie finished explaining and was about to mock Bryce, but she didn't expect him to hang up without saying a word. She was stunned for a moment when she saw that the call had ended. Then she burst out laughing. Why is Bryce acting so weird? In his office, Bryce was left feeling annoyed. After listening to Natalie's explanation, he also noticed some clues in the photo. The first time he had seen it, he had reacted impulsively and had not paid proper attention to it. But what made him really frustrated and annoyed was that he started to act like a jealous man. After hanging up the phone, Natalie was still thinking about Bryce, but she felt a little better. Recently, after spending more time with Bryce, she had become more familiar with his moods and temper. He was actually not too cold. Maybe it had something to do with him being alone for a long time. Thinking of this, a faint smile appeared on Natalie's face. After lunch that day, the applicant for the assistant's job came by. Someone brought her to Natalie's office, and she quickly saw that she was indeed as lively and talkative as she'd seemed on the phone call. She was neat and petite. Natalie smiled at her in a friendly way and asked, "What's your name? How old are you? Have you graduated?" The young woman answered efficiently, saying, "Mrs. Davidson, my name is Jill Tyson. I'm 21 years old, and yes, I have graduated from university." She smiled. Natalie continued, "Well, Jill, the assistant's job has a few different aspects. Some of the jobs are running errands, going out with Tony to take pictures to help him, and sometimes you also need to carry luggage. Can you do all that?" She was a little concerned about Jill's physical endurance, but Jill immediately nodded, saying, "Yes, I'm not afraid of any of those tasks. I'm fit and strong, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Seeing that Natalie was still doubtful, Jill added, "To tell you the truth, when my mother was sick and was in the hospital, I worked 3 jobs a day sometimes. I'm really not afraid of hard work." Natalie nodded. She admired Jill's perseverance at such a young age. Given Jill's tenacious personality, she was quite satisfied with her. She said, "You seem like a good fit for this role, but I want to emphasize that chasing after stars and working are 2 different things. You have to keep those things separate, okay?" Jill nodded happily and replied, "Okay, Mrs. Davidson, I understand." Just then, Tony came into the office, and Natalie said to him, "Tony, this is the applicant for the assistant job. Her name is Jill." Earlier, if Jill had seen Tony, she would have been at loss for words. But since she was in an interview for a job, she kept her composure as she nodded to Tony and said, "Hello, Mr. Bavel." Tony nodded back. He didn't have much expression on his face. He said to Natalie, "Natalie, I don't have any objections." Natalie said, "Excellent. That's settled then. Jill, you can report to my office tomorrow morning. Sound okay?" Jill grinned and said, "Wonderful. Thank you, Miss Davidson. Thank you, Mr. Bavel. I will definitely work." Natalie said, "That's cool. And from now on you can call me Natalie, and you can call Tony Tony." Jill grinned and nodded, and then she left. They could hear her footsteps skipping down the hallway. Natalie secretly felt that this girl was very suitable. Tony generally had a flat and gloomy aura. Maybe he needed a lively and youthful personality around him to give him a lift. Tony stood there looking at his feet. Natalie asked, "Tony, do you need anything?" He said, "No, there's nothing else. I'll go train." He looked at Natalie with a complicated expression before turning around and leaving. Natalie was a little confused. She guessed that Tony had always hidden things deep in his heart, and that he was doing that again now. Perhaps it was because he was under more pressure due to the recent boost in his career, but she put this matter to the back of her mind and carried on working. After handing over Jill's resume to the HR department and chatting with the HR manager for a while, she encountered an unwelcome face in the hallway as she came out. Mark Ellington, whom she hadn't seen for a few days. When Ellington saw her, his eyes flickered as if he felt guilty. He looked tired and worried. He didn't try to engage with her as he usually did. Instead, he turned around and walked in the opposite direction, seemingly trying to escape. When she saw this, she laughed coldly to herself. Then she caught up with Ellington and blocked his path. "Mark," she said smoothly, "it's been a few days since we last met, but you seem to have gotten a lot more haggard all of a sudden. And where are you going in such a hurry?" As she did this, she glanced at the document in Ellington's hand. It was an endorsement document for male cosmetics, and she knew the brand. It was a foreign brand called Kara. Ellington noticed Natalie looking at the document and moved it behind him, out of her view. He glanced at her and said, "I might not have been sleeping too well recently. If there's nothing else, I'll be going." Ellington was about to leave, but Natalie sneered sarcastically. "What have you been up to? Have you done too many bad things and now your conscience won't let you sleep?" Ellington's face darkened. He was about to flare up, but he suddenly remembered Howard's warning to him about keeping clear of Natalie for the moment. He glared at her before leaving with the document in his hand. He didn't want to anger anyone who might be a threat to his own position and success. It hadn't been easy for him to get where he was today, and he wanted to hang on to his status. Watching Ellington disappear, Natalie narrowed her eyes. He'd acted a bit weird just now. What had happened to her the other night was definitely related to Ellington. She just knew it. Although she didn't have any evidence right now, her intuition couldn't be wrong. Perhaps Ellington was the mastermind behind all of this? Maybe he had planned to get her into Howard's bed? That way, he could have vented his anger against her and pleased Howard. Mulling this over, she became even angrier with Ellington. He'd drugged her and schemed against her, causing her to be humiliated in such a way that had almost ended in disaster for her. And he still wanted to get away with it, unscathed. Did he think that avoiding her would be the end of it? She definitely wouldn't let these two people off. Neither of them would forget her once she had finished with them. Natalie stood there thinking for a moment. Then she seemed to suddenly recall something, and she hurried back to her office. She opened up her laptop and quickly searched for information about Kara. It turned out that the company had been growing rapidly recently. They needed to get a celebrity as a spokesperson, and if they wanted to rise quickly, they had to find a celebrity who was in line with their brand image and who was trending. Traditionally, female-oriented cosmetics were endorsed by female celebrities, and male-oriented cosmetics by male celebrities. This company didn't follow that pattern. They had found a popular actress, Tara Malinowski, to endorse their brand overall, but now they were also looking for a male star to work with them on endorsements. They were preparing to break into the international market and were preparing for this as well. Natalie thought for a while before searching for different information. Based on the current situation, it seemed to her that all the male A-list celebrities had already been contracted for this kind of endorsement, so there was no way for them to work with Kara. Maybe the company would find a second echelon actor to endorse their brand? She closed her laptop and stared into the distance, thinking hard. Although Tony has been in the limelight recently and has also gained quite a few fans, he is not really a male celebrity yet. However, if he could win this endorsement this time and get exposure to a mass market by writing on the back of Tara Milanowski's established profile, it would greatly improve his reputation. She muttered to herself, that just might work. But then she thought of something else. Hold on a minute. Since Ellington had that endorsement document, it looks as if he's already working to get someone the contract. But who could that be? She opened up her laptop again and scouted around social media, trying to find out what the gossip on the web was saying about this. Who were Ellington's options for this endorsement? She muttered to herself as she looked at stories on the web. Harry Ellington. He's become famous recently, and it seems like he has arrangements already, so it can't be him. So the only possibility is Curtis Westing. Huh. She thought to herself, Curtis Westing has looks and character, but Tony is much superior in both respects. I wonder how many fans he has. Then she curled her lip. She didn't think Curtis Westing could compete with Tony. So Tony's chances of winning were high. Provided that Curtis Westing didn't play any tricks, Tony could easily win the Kara endorsement. Natalie didn't waste any more time. She stood up and headed to the practice room. Tony was still working out in the practice room. His skin was covered with sweat, and the ground below him was wet where his sweat had dripped. He was breathing heavily. Seeing Natalie walked in, he immediately stopped what he was doing, wiped the sweat off his face with a towel, and walked toward her. Tony's body had developed well because of the hard training. He now had well-defined abs, and the muscles on his arms were ropey and hard. He was full of energy. Tony no longer looked like a boy. He was a strong and powerful man. Natalie waved at Tony and said, "It's okay, continue training, but listen." Tony nodded. "Okay, sure." Natalie continued, "I want to take a few close-up pictures of you. No makeup, no filters." With that, she picked up her phone and prepared to take the photos. Tony felt a bit awkward and self-conscious. He couldn't focus on his training, so his actions were a bit awkward. She said, "Try not to be so stiff. Relax. We need some natural photos. Don't tell me you're worried that I'll take ugly photos and release them." "Of course not," said Tony, shaking his head. He knew that Natalie had her own reasons for doing this, and that she would absolutely not do anything to harm him, so he relaxed his mind and followed her instructions. After Natalie had taken a few more photos, she stood there admiring her work. Sure enough, Tony was as good-looking as ever, strong and attractive. "Perfect," she muttered to herself. She immediately opened her social media account and added some of the new photos there, adding captions, "Close-up shots of a star working his body. Don't miss them." She smiled as the images were posted. After a short while, the post had gained traction. 300,000 likes. Pretty good. She flipped through the fans' comments, who were excited and ecstatic. Tony's appeal to his fans just seemed to get stronger and stronger. Some fans were even saying that they wanted to marry Tony. She couldn't help but laugh out loud as she flipped through the comments. As she scrolled down, she saw that some of the fans were referring back to the optimal photo shoot, urging her to become an actress. Natalie looked at the screen and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She then contacted the media and got the post promoted more widely. The number of likes and comments on her social media accounts rocketed. Eventually, her social media pages found their way into the top searches lists. Over the next few days, these news articles on social media became more and more popular and occupied the headlines. Tony's popularity increased, and the number of his fans also increased rapidly. Although these social media results were pretty good, there was still no news from Kara. Unfortunately, Natalie didn't have a way to contact the Kara company directly. She was gradually becoming disappointed. It seemed to her that her bid to attract Kara's attention to Tony was not working. Natalie had put in a lot of effort to bring Tony out of the shadows and into the limelight, but her recent tactics to gain Kara's attention didn't seem to be working. Will she be able to bag the endorsement, or will Ellington get it for Curtis? Natalie didn't know that, even as she sat worrying, the Kara Management Group was holding a meeting to talk about company branding. The meeting room was on the top floor of a skyscraper, with big glass windows giving views across the city. The first agenda on the list of the people in charge of the U.S. domestic market was the selection of a celebrity brand ambassador. This was the most important step for them in entering the U.S. market, so all the higher-ups in the company were attending the meeting too. One of the directors in charge of operating the U.S. market said, "We can't just randomly find a star to endorse our breakthrough into the market. We need to specifically target male artists who can quickly increase our popularity." The marketing manager nodded her head and said, "Yes, I agree. Personally, I think that Harry Ellington is not a bad choice." The director said, "Harry Ellington is fine, but we have to remember, of course, that the first-tier male celebrities are all already contracted to other companies. We can only take a step back and look for second-tier male celebrities."
Huwag ka
The
dyan.
marketing manager thought for a moment before speaking to the assistant beside her, saying, "Jimmy, go and check out the information on the second-tier male artists. See if there are any suitable celebrities." Jimmy left. After a while, he returned with a laptop and projected the material he'd gathered onto the screen. He introduced all the potential celebrities that were suitable for promoting the company's cosmetics products. As the images on the screen changed, the marketing manager noticed Curtis Westing's face and signaled Jimmy to pause. The marketing manager said, "What do you think about this Curtis Westing? He's a second-tier celebrity. I think he's pretty good. He could suit our brand." The marketing manager was a fan of Curtis Westing. Another person shook their head. "I don't think so. The vibe Curtis Westing gives off doesn't seem to be in line with Jill Malinowski's temperament." The situation was in a deadlock again. Everyone had their own candidates, but there was no consensus. None of the candidates seemed to have the right combination of temperament and looks. The director didn't say anything. He just looked quietly at his phone the whole time. Then he exclaimed, "What do you guys think of this guy?" Everyone looked at the phone in the director's hands. On the screen were the workout photos of Tony that Natalie had taken. The group was impressed. Someone said, "His looks are good, but I wonder what his reputation is like. What's his public profile?" Jimmy called out Tony's details and career history. The people sitting there could tell that Tony was just an unknown minor artist, and they felt disappointed. The marketing manager said, "I think we should forget about him. His popularity level doesn't meet our requirements." Someone else said, "But I heard he recently bagged a role in a movie and has done quite a few advertisements, so he's quite popular on social media." The marketing manager retorted, "Social media fame is only temporary. For a true celebrity, what I'm looking for is traffic and fame." The discussion went out of control again, looping around. This time, the voices of opposition to Tony were much louder than those in support. No one dared to take the risk and let a small artist speak for the company. If the results weren't good, they would lose their own share dividends. Finally, the senior director, who had been sitting at the head of the table, Shirley Ross, suddenly glanced at everyone. Her eyes were filled with dignity, and she gradually silenced the hubbub. Shirley was a veteran in the industry, so her words carried a lot of weight. Shirley said, "Let me say a few words. This Tony Bavel is at Star Entertainment, and Star, as you may not know, is owned by Claire Group." Everyone couldn't help but be curious. Someone said, "If Star is such a big backer, why are they performing so badly in the market?" Someone else said, "It's true that Star is part of the Claire Group, but the person in charge at Star, Howard Claire, is famous for being a wastrel. That's why Star never improves." Shirley said, "But things are different now. I heard from an insider that Star is currently reorganizing itself and is being taken over by high-ranking leaders from the Claire Group, including Bryce Claire." After Shirley had finished speaking, astonishment and disbelief appeared on some faces. Bryce was the CEO of Claire Group, which was involved with a lot of industries, but he had entertainment industry assets that no one could compete with. Shirley tapped on the table and continued, "Tony Bavel's manager also seems to be a powerful character. You can see that from the recent news on social media." Shirley was also someone who cherished talent. That agent, Natalie, had a good eye. She'd found Tony and dug out gold. When the subordinates heard what Shirley said, they asked her, "What do you think we should do next?" Shirley thought for a moment before saying, "Let's assume that if this Tony Bavel becomes really popular within half a year, then his price will double. So why don't we sign him now, while he's still relatively cheap? After all, there's still some time before the date for the commercial shoot." Some people expressed doubts about the risks of doing this and about the threat to the company's reputation if the move didn't work out. But Shirley smiled confidently. She said, In all the years our company has been developing, when has there ever been a time when we didn't take risks? But the fact is, we've always succeeded, right? Her eyes scanned the crowd one by one and she said, "If something negative happens, I will take full responsibility." No one else had anything to say. The matter was decided, and the meeting ended.
Oh, yes.
In the evening, Natalie returned home. She was not in a good mood. There had still not been any news from Kara. Liam put down his homework when he saw his mom's sour expression. He ran to her side affectionately and said, "Mommy, what's wrong? Are you unhappy?" Seeing Liam, Natalie's mood improved a little. She hugged him and smiled, saying, "I'm fine. I'm just worried about work. Don't worry, Liam." Liam immediately puffed out his chest and vowed to Natalie, "Mommy, it's hard on you. When I grow up, you won't have to work so hard to earn money. I'll look after you." The little guy looked extremely determined, and Natalie was moved. She hugged him and gave him a kiss, feeling extremely happy. Just at that moment, Mrs. Perkins had arrived. She smiled and said, "That's right, Mrs. Claire, don't work so hard. Can't you just let Liam look after you?" As Mrs. Perkins finished speaking, Bryce happened to be walking down the stairs and heard what Mrs. Perkins said. He glanced at Natalie without saying anything. Natalie was embarrassed and quickly changed the topic. "Liam, it's getting late. Hurry up and go to bed. Be a good boy." Liam nodded obediently, and Mrs. Perkins followed him up the stairs. She stayed in the living room by herself and continued working on her laptop. She still didn't want to give up this Kara opportunity. She wanted to see if she could connect with the cosmetics company. Bryce came and sat beside Natalie. Seeing her working so intensely, he asked, "What are you so busy with? You should rest." He was surprised by the caring tone in his own voice and looked at her with a complicated expression. However, she was so busy that she didn't notice his strangeness. She sighed and then briefly recounted her recent attempts to boost Tony's global social media profile and hook up with Kara. She couldn't help but lament, "I just returned home and still don't have any connection with Kara. I really don't know how to connect with them." Bryce didn't say anything, but his eyes suddenly turned darker. After a while, seeing that Natalie was busy, he said in a casual manner, "I have a party to attend tomorrow. Would you like to accompany me?" Natalie didn't react for a while. Then she looked at him in puzzlement and said, "You're going to the city gala, right? Why should I go?" After all, her relationship with Bryce was still a secret. Wouldn't it create gossip and misunderstanding if she accompanied him to the gala? Bryce's face immediately turned cold. He stood up and snorted unhappily. "Okay, forget it." He was about to head upstairs and didn't even glance at her. Natalie was very alert. She immediately understood that Bryce had an ulterior motive in mind and immediately grabbed his sleeve, saying, Bryce, who else will be at the gala?" Sensing her hand pulling at his sleeve, Bryce surprisingly didn't shake it off. He pondered for a moment and then said, "There'll be lots of movie stars, sports stars, big business people, those kinds of folks." Her eyes immediately lit up. If there were celebrities at the gala, she might find an endorsement connection there for Tony. Noticing that she remained silent for a long time, he gradually lost his patience. Feeling a little irritated, he shook her off and went upstairs. She had no time to care about anything else. After thinking for a minute, she ran upstairs after him. She smiled at him and said, "Bryce, do you have a list of guests for the gala that I can look at?" Bryce grunted. His eyes were cold again. "Didn't you say you couldn't go? I'm going to look for someone else to accompany me." He pushed her away, intending to go back to his room. She panicked and grabbed his arm, saying, "Don't do that. I was just joking. Don't be angry." She definitely had to seize such a good opportunity. He was still unmoved. "You missed your one chance. Now get out of the way. I need to rest." With that, he pushed her away again as if he was determined to return to his room. Natalie pulled at his arm and refused to let go. "Bryce, please, let me take a look at the list of the names for the gala. Just one glance." "No," said Bryce resolutely. Losing her cool, she sneered, "I bet you don't even have a list. You don't even know who's going to the gala." Then she recovered herself, feeling anxious. She gripped his arm tightly and tried to curry favor with him, saying, "I was wrong, okay? I shouldn't have refused. Please forgive me." Bryce felt the pressure on his arm and her weight and warmth as she leaned against him. A feeling of gentleness came over him, even a little numbness. Damn it, he thought, remembering how he'd felt jealous about the pictures of her with Tony. He hated to feel so vulnerable and weak. He stiffened with resentment. Natalie noticed Bryce's change in mood. She quickly let go of his arm. She was too embarrassed to stay any longer, saying, "Don't worry about it. It's fine." She was blushing with embarrassment. She was about to turn around and leave when Bryce stopped her. He said, "What are you running for? You don't want the list of attendees anymore." His voice was suddenly soft and warm. Her face turned even redder. She did not dare to look at his face as she said, "Then give it to me, please." Only then did he hand the document to her. She kept her head down and hurriedly said, "Thank you." After that, she turned around and left quietly. Bryce watched her disappear down the hallway. He realized that he had been holding his breath, and he let it out in a sigh. He thought about the pressure of her hands on his arm, and how he wanted to kiss her at that moment, but he felt too shy and vulnerable to do so. The next morning, Natalie received a call from the marketing manager at Kara. She was still in bed, but her sleepiness immediately disappeared. Holding the phone, she pretended to be calm and asked, "Hello, is there anything I can help you with?" The manager said, "It's like this. We want Tony Bavel to be our new brand ambassador. Do you think Tony's schedule can accommodate that?" Suppressing her excitement, she deliberately paused for a moment, rustling some papers before saying in a calm tone, "Yes, I've checked Tony's schedule and there shouldn't be a problem." The manager said, "Excellent. If there are no problems, please come over this afternoon and we can talk. I hope we can cooperate fruitfully." The manager hung up. Natalie couldn't hide her excitement. Sitting up in bed, she thought about the gala Bryce had mentioned last night. She felt that she should really try and attend because she didn't have a wide network of contacts, and she needed opportunities like this to come her way. Natalie ate her breakfast hurriedly and left for the office in a rush. She was relieved that she hadn't seen Bryce that morning. Arriving at the office, she planned to tell Tony and Jill about the news straight away. This would boost their morale. But when she arrived, she heard a clamor over in the practice room. It sounded like a fight. She had a bad premonition. She quickened her steps and went over to take a look. Only then did she realize that it was a fight between Curtis Westing and Tony. Tony was dodging out of the way as Curtis swung at him. Jill was there too, trying to get between them. Curtis was shouting angrily, jabbing a finger in Tony's face. "You dare to sneak in ahead of me to steal the Kara endorsement? You dare to cheat me? I'm going to teach you a lesson you won't forget." He cursed violently as he tried to attack Tony. Tony had a cold expression on his face. He didn't counterattack, just defended himself. Natalie stood to the side and listened for a moment. It was only when Curtis started swearing and shouting about Kara that she realized what had happened. She let out a cold laugh as she got in between the two sparring men. She glared coldly at Curtis and said, "Curtis, can I ask you what you're talking about? The Kara company has the final saying in anything related to the endorsements. How could Tony steal your endorsements? Don't spout nonsense." Curtis was furious, anger boiling inside him with nowhere to go. He responded, snapping at her, "Don't distort the truth. Everything was set up for me by Mark Ellington. I was about to bag the deal. I don't know how Tony's done it, but he's snatched it away from me." Curtis thought Tony must have done some shady business with someone with influence at Kara, allowing him to snatch away the endorsement from Curtis. He couldn't help but look at Tony with contempt. Tony felt hurt at being stared at like that without cause. His eyes were red as he looked at Curtis. Natalie remained calm and made sure that Tony was hidden behind her. She glanced at Curtis coldly and said, "Then you should go and find Mark Ellington and talk to him about this. Why did you come here and make a scene? Do you think we can be easily bullied?" Her glare unnerved Curtis. He just stood there blankly and didn't reply. She added, "Or, if you're dissatisfied with Kara's decision-making, why don't you call them and ask them why they didn't choose you?" Her tone was full of disdain. Curtis Westing didn't know how to respond. He could only glare at Natalie angrily. At the moment, he had no arguments he could use to refute her. Mark Ellington had also heard the commotion, and now he too came into the practice room. Without saying anything, he slapped Curtis across the face, shouting, "What a disgrace! What are you doing here? Get out of here, you idiot!" Ellington was about to go crazy with anger. Originally, he had been angry that he had lost the endorsement opportunity, but now he was livid with Curtis for stirring up such a ruckus. Seeing this, Natalie couldn't help but let out a mocking laugh. "Ellington, your people certainly need to be kept under control, but if you beat them up, they should call the cops." Ellington's face twisted with anger as he spat. "Stop trying to be cute. You clearly saw the information about Kara in my hand that day. How else could Tony have gotten this endorsement ahead of Curtis?" Natalie laughed. "So what if that's the case? Everyone is competing fairly and you've lost. That's the truth. If you don't like it, tough luck." Although she was smiling inside, the smile didn't reach her face. The way she looked at Ellington made his hair stand on end. The onlooking people were speechless. This Natalie was fearless. Everyone looked at Mark Ellington to see how he would react, as if they were waiting to see a good show. Ellington pointed angrily at Natalie and growled, "I wouldn't be so proud of your recent achievements if I were you. If you cross me, you will regret it." He thought that his good connections in the entertainment industry would make it easy for him to get Natalie ostracized and isolated. Natalie feigned panic and said with heavy sarcasm, "Oh, what a big man you are. You scared me to death." Ellington was taken aback for a moment. He looked at the crowd of onlookers, then turned and left in a dejected manner. Natalie called out after him, "Before you do anything, think about the consequences. You better watch your back. I know what you did." He looked back at Natalie. Seeing the icy coldness in her eyes, he blanched, understanding immediately that she must have found out about his part in her kidnapping and drugging. She was clearly taking her revenge on him. Ellington didn't say anything else, just hurriedly left the training room with Curtis. After Mark Ellington left, the onlookers all went back to their own business, leaving just Natalie, Tony, and Jill in the training room. Once everyone else had left, Jill quickly ran up to Natalie and gave her a high five. "Natalie, you were so cool just now." She humorously mimicked Natalie scolding Ellington. Natalie smiled, amused by her enthusiasm and high spirits, but she pretended to be angry and told her, "Stop messing around. Take Tony and treat his wounds." Tony had been punched twice by Curtis and had a couple of bruises and nicks on his face. Jill ran off to get the medical kit and the medical staff to treat Tony's wounds. Fortunately, Tony's injuries weren't too serious. His face was slightly swollen, but that would soon heal. Natalie relaxed a little and sternly warned Tony, "Don't forget that you are an artist. Even if there are people who want to beat you up, you need to protect your face. Your face is your fortune, understand?" Tony nodded. He felt helpless about what had happened just now. When Natalie saw that Tony was looking so downcast, her face turned cold. She looked at him sternly and said, "Tony, if anyone attacks you again, you have my permission to beat them up." Her domineering words made him shudder. He looked at her with excitement in his eyes. He wanted to say something, but hesitated. Natalie interrupted Tony. "You what? Remember what I said. I won't let you get hurt." Her heart ached when she saw that he was feeling upset and hurt, so she couldn't bear to say any more. Tony watched her leave. He seemed to see life more clearly suddenly. When Mark Ellington reached his office with Curtis Westing, he had screamed, "God damn it!" and angrily swept aside all the documents on his desk. His grating voice and red face revealed his extreme anger, and Curtis was frightened by this. He hardly dared to breathe. He looked at Curtis, breathing hard, and shouted, "Trash! You're just a piece of trash! Why are you so impulsive that you had to seek them out to settle the score? You have to play these things cool in the future." He glared at Curtis. If it wasn't for Curtis's good service to him in the past, he might have struck him again. Curtis was suddenly also full of anger. He felt even more wronged when Ellington treated him like this. He said, I didn't know things would turn out like this, but I just couldn't take it anymore. That job should have been mine. How did Tony get it? Hearing Tony's name, Ellington's face darkened even more. He grabbed a cup off the desk beside him and threw it at Curtis, shouting, Idiot! If you couldn't take it, you should have still held back. Why didn't I realize that you were so impulsive? Curtis gritted his teeth in pain from where the cup had smashed into him. He retorted, I just can't bear to see Natalie and Tony get away with this. Ellington warned him coldly, You have to bear it. I'm telling you, you can't mess things up like this. Otherwise, I won't be able to protect you anymore. Hearing this threat, Curtis was momentarily shocked. He walked over to Ellington and said, Look, Mark, I know I was wrong. I was too rash in this matter. Please don't be angry with me. This seemed to placate Ellington somewhat, but his face remained cold and impassive. Seeing that Ellington's temper had cooled, Curtis said, But all the same, Mark, I've suffered. And do you really want to see them looking so pleased with themselves? Natalie was just loving it. Recalling the scene just now, Ellington ground his teeth with resentment. He said, Don't worry, I won't let them remain that cocky. Just wait and see, I can handle her. Seeing Ellington so confident gave Curtis a boost too, and he started to feel better about himself. Although he had suffered a loss today, if Mark stayed on his side, he didn't believe that Natalie and Tony could last much longer. If it wasn't for the power of Ellington and his connections, he wouldn't have stayed attached to him. Sensing Ellington looking at him, he smiled. Ellington smiled back and stepped towards him, holding out his hand. Then he stopped himself suddenly and looked at him with displeasure, realizing that someone might see them together like this. They had to be tactful about their relationship when they were in the office. Ellington said, Look, Curtis, just wait for me tonight, okay? Curtis nodded before turning around and leaving. When he turned his face towards the door, there was hatred and disgust in his eyes. He realized that he hated being under Ellington's control like this. Natalie guessed that Mark Ellington wouldn't let matters rest. However, she wasn't afraid of that. If Ellington really came looking for trouble with her, she would react. She had never been afraid of anyone. She would not show any mercy to that man. In the afternoon, she told Tony to get ready, and they then went to the Kara Cosmetics company to meet with the person in charge. On the way there, she talked him through the situation. When they arrived, a secretary led them to the director's office. The secretary knocked on the door, opened it, and said, Miss Ross, Tony Bovel and his manager are here. Shirley Ross said, Bring them in. Shirley put aside the papers on her desk and looked at the two people in front of her. Natalie said, Hello, I'm Natalie Davidson, and this is Tony. She extended her hand politely and smiled at Shirley sincerely. Shirley shook Natalie's hand and said, Welcome. I'm Shirley Ross, the person in charge here. Please take a seat. She motioned for the secretary to pour them some coffee. A glint flashed in her eyes. She had asked Natalie and Tony to come to her office so that she could investigate their backgrounds. After all, she was betting her future on them to some extent. Was Shirley doing the right thing by choosing Tony for her brand endorsement? Will the gamble she played by choosing Tony pay off?
Hey, ever tried writing on Pocket FM? It's unbelievably easy.
Really? How so?
Just pick a theme, let your thoughts flow, and boom, your story's ready to be heard.
Sounds simple. Gotta give it a shot.
Just head over to the right tab on the bottom of your screen and start writing.
Natalie thought it was indeed something to celebrate. She nodded her head and said, All right, let's go and have dinner together. But as soon as she finished talking, she suddenly remembered that she was going to the city gala with Bryce tonight. With a troubled expression, she said, Damn, I just remembered that I can't go tonight. I have another engagement already. Why don't you two go? I'll treat you to dinner. Tony asked, Natalie, is there anything else you need tonight? She nodded. Yes, there is one thing. Jill, please send Tony back when you're done eating dinner. Jill nodded. Although she regretted not going out to eat with Natalie, she liked the idea of getting a chance to be alone with Tony. Natalie hurried home. There was a nice gown at the house, the one Bryce bought for her last time. She thought it would be great if she could put that on and go to the gala after she changed at home. When she got home, she was startled to see the dress shop manager, Miranda Starr, standing in the vestibule alongside Mrs. Perkins. She looked at them both with a surprised expression. Mrs. Perkins hurried over to her and explained, "Mrs. Clare, I heard that you're going to the gala tonight. Mr. Clare specifically asked Miranda to come over and help to style your makeup and dress." Natalie sighed helplessly. Bryce was indeed someone who cared about his reputation. He even thought about all these small details with that in mind. Natalie and Miranda went upstairs to her suite of rooms. It took them more than 2 hours to get her hair and makeup done. After everything was finished, Natalie was so tired that she was about to collapse. Coincidentally, at that time, Bryce also came back. Looking at Natalie, Bryce was stunned for a moment. Her long hair was pinned up, making her look super sophisticated. Everything about her dress, hair, and makeup was perfect. Bryce commented approvingly, "Miranda, your work just gets better and better. Amazing." Natalie didn't like hearing this, thinking that it was the foundation that Miranda was working with that was important, but she didn't say anything. There was a look in his eye, something different about him, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what was different. Miranda heard Bryce's praise and smiled, saying, "I told you that Natalie's foundation was good. All I had to do was make some slight refinements, and she's perfect." Natalie blushed at this praise. She glanced covertly at Bryce and noticed that his expression had returned to its normal state. She calmed down a little. Finally, Miranda gave Bryce a simple makeover. By the time he and Natalie were ready, it was already almost 8 o'clock. As the two of them left the house, he indicated that Natalie should take his hand. It would make a nice picture. Watching the two of them leave in the car, Mrs. Perkins exclaimed, "Oh, it seems like the two of them really are compatible." Miranda, who was standing next to Mrs. Perkins, said, "Mrs. Perkins, who on earth is Natalie?" Natalie's relationship with Bryce was a strange one, and Miranda couldn't figure it out. "Well, that's Mrs. Clare," said Mrs. Perkins. "She's married to Bryce." Miranda stared at Mrs. Perkins with her eyes wide open in shock. She mumbled, "What? You say he's married to Natalie?" This was astonishing. Even if he hadn't revealed this to people, hadn't it happened a bit too fast? This was simply unbelievable. Amazing. The city gala was taking place in the banqueting hall of the Central Plaza Hotel. Bryce's limousine pulled up outside the hotel, and the driver opened the doors to let them out. Natalie's hands were sweating a little. She'd rarely attended such a glamorous party, so she was a bit nervous. Bryce sensed her nervousness, so he tightened his grip on her hand. He chuckled. "Don't be nervous. You're not here to please anyone. Just enjoy yourself." He smiled at her. He rarely smiled, but when he did smile, the world seemed to brighten. Seeing his smile, Natalie suddenly became less nervous. They walked hand in hand into the banqueting hall. The gala had already begun, and quite a few people had already arrived. There were guests chatting in groups of 2s and 3s, and amidst the liveliness, different groups of men and women attracted attention as the crowd shifted. Bryce walked into the gala with Natalie on his arm. The crowd's attention immediately swung towards Natalie. Natalie walked in a leisurely fashion, aware of how elegant she looked. Bryce was wearing an exquisitely tailored suit. The sight of them, side by side, drew many looks of admiration. What a perfect couple. Sensing the gaze of the onlookers on Natalie, Bryce's expression turned cold, and he shielded Natalie from view with his body. Seeing his warning look, the surrounding people quickly retracted their gaze from Natalie and instead greeted Bryce with a smile. At the same time, they were even more curious about Natalie. Bryce's presence at the party had already surprised them, and now there was a mysterious woman beside him. Samuel and Vivian were also at the gala. They sat together and chatted at the rear of the hall, unaware that Bryce had arrived. Vivian's mood seemed to be a bit low. She asked Samuel, "Do you think Bryce will come tonight?" Samuel drank a mouthful of red wine. He hid his disappointment and shook his head as he said, "You know he hates occasions like this. I doubt he'll come." Bryce was not a great fan of attending all these parties, so they obviously had their doubts. Vivian had a soft spot for Bryce, so she deep down wanted him to come. Vivian is enamored of Bryce. Will she be able to keep her calm when she sees him with Natalie? Or will jealousy get the better of her? Shirley talked for a while over coffee, and Natalie and Tony, according to her, performed quite decently. She could not help but be impressed with them. After chatting for a bit more, she went straight to the point, asking Natalie, "So, tell me about your background." Although she'd heard about Natalie's excellence, she hadn't been able to find her resume anywhere. Natalie felt that there was nothing to hide, so she replied honestly, "I've always been an agent, overseas mostly, and I only returned to this country this year." Shirley nodded. No wonder she couldn't find out much about Natalie. She'd been plying her trade abroad all this time. She turned her gaze towards Tony. Only then did she realize that Tony was even more handsome than he appeared to be in his photos. His good looks were completely natural, without the slightest bit of embellishment. Shirley said, "Tony makes a wonderful impression visually, especially as his looks are so obviously natural. I really appreciate that." The cosmetics industry liked the idea of natural beauty as the baseline. This baseline enhanced the appeal of their products. Tony smiled genuinely. "Thank you. I'll definitely try not to disappoint you." When he said these words, he no longer had the reticence and hesitation he'd shown in the past. It was as if he felt calm and confident about everything and took it all in his stride. Natalie gave Tony an admiring look, secretly surprised by the change in his confidence levels. She'd been worried that he might not perform in a satisfactory way when he met Shirley. Shirley continued, "Natalie, I've always been curious about how you managed to unlock Tony's potential. After all, Tony has been with Star Entertainment for a long time, but has only started to come to prominence recently." Natalie and Tony looked at each other. Noticing the hurt in his eyes, she gave him a reassuring look. Natalie said, "As you can see, Tony's strengths are immediately apparent. I didn't need to dig to find them. Tony was in the shadows before because his previous manager didn't have the ability to develop and leverage talented people." Shirley, impressed with Natalie's answers, said, "I think you're underestimating yourself out of modesty. No one else would have been able to create a big social media stir like you did for Tony." Everyone had seen Tony's explosive growth in popularity a few days ago. Natalie smiled and nodded, but remained silent. So Shirley said, "Natalie, I'll speak plainly to you. There are actually quite a lot of different opinions inside the company about using Tony as our new brand ambassador. I've taken a liking to Tony and to you because you are so impressive. So, I'm going to bet everything, including my reputation, on him and on you. If this advertising campaign results in losses for the company, I will be the first one to suffer." Shirley looked shrewdly at Tony and Natalie before she added, "So don't let me down, okay?" Natalie nodded. "Of course, we will do our very best, and I guarantee that we won't disappoint your company. You can rest assured." Then she smiled confidently and added, "Also, the casting of The Crossing 2 is going to end next month. At that time, Tony's popularity and exposure will make him totally worthy of this endorsement arrangement." Natalie knew that Tony's popularity wasn't yet as high as that of other celebrities, but she believed that this was only a temporary shortfall. Shirley smiled back at Natalie. She felt more confident and laughed heartily as she said, "I'm really looking forward to working with you both." A rare smile lit up her normally serious face. Natalie chuckled. Her eyes became more and more confident. "Don't worry, Shirley. You will definitely not lose out if you choose Tony." Shirley said, "All right, we'll wait and see. But I believe that you won't let me down." She laughed. With the matter settled between Shirley, Natalie, and Tony, the next step was to agree to the financial aspects and then moving on to start filming. Before signing the contract, Shirley asked if Tony could do some test shots for the company's cameraman. Just as they were about to go and do this, Natalie caught Tony's eye and whispered, "Work hard. I think highly of you." Tony nodded. "I know. I will." And he was no longer nervous. When they arrived at the studio, many people looked at Tony. Using him as a brand ambassador was controversial inside the company, just as Shirley had said. Many people hadn't thought much about it to begin with, but now, after all the gossip, they were waiting to see if it would work out okay or go wrong. But Tony immediately got the approval of the photographer, and Shirley and the people on the sidelines had nothing else to say. In fact, it seemed that the rumors were right, and that he really was a rising star. And so the contract was signed smoothly. When Natalie came out and looked at the contract in her hands, she heaved a sigh of relief. After all, with this contract, the matter was finally settled. She said, "Tony, you did well today. You're amazing." If it hadn't been for Tony's performance, Shirley probably wouldn't have signed the contract with such eagerness. Tony smiled shyly. "It's nothing. It's all because of you, Natalie." Natalie sighed. She didn't understand why he looked like a shy little boy whenever he looked at her. Jill was delighted when she heard the news. She filed the contract away and looked at the two of them excitedly. "The contract is signed. Should we go out tonight and celebrate?" Just as Samuel finished speaking, there was a sudden commotion on the other side of the hall. Voices rising and feet shuffling as a buzz of excitement spread through the crowd. Everyone's gaze turned in that direction. Only then did they notice that Bryce had walked in. Vivian's heart gave a little leap, and then it sank again as she saw Natalie walking beside him. Samuel was also surprised to see Bryce and Natalie together like this. He looked sideways at Vivian. Vivian was greatly alarmed. She stared at Bryce and Natalie, walking hand in hand, and her face turned deathly pale. She said in a trembling voice, "Samuel, didn't that woman say that she was a relative of the Clare family?" How could Vivian not be anxious? Even a fool could see that the relationship between Bryce and Natalie was something unusual. She was angry at Samuel and grumbled, "Samuel, did you lie to me about that woman?" He rubbed his nose in embarrassment and said with a tight smile, "Well, I didn't expect to see them together here tonight." Vivian, noticing that he hadn't answered her question directly, looked at him with irritation. At that moment, Samuel really wanted to call Bryce over to complain to him about forcing him into the embarrassing position of having to deceive people on Bryce's behalf. Vivian knew that he hadn't been candid with her and complained, "Samuel, you lied to me about them, and they misled me too. Oh, this is too much. But since Bryce is here, of course, I must go over and greet him." With that, Vivian walked over to Bryce. Samuel followed. Bryce was surrounded by a tight knot of people. Many people came close to fawning over him, wanting to leave a good impression on him. Who wouldn't want to ingratiate themselves with the mighty CEO of the Clare Group? He maintained a calm and detached attitude, as if this kind of scene was a common one for him. On the other hand, Natalie was flustered. After all, she had never seen such a commotion before. The inquiring gazes of those people made her feel even more uncomfortable. At that moment, Vivian and Samuel also came over to greet them. She hadn't expected to meet Vivian here. She glanced at Bryce and felt a little embarrassed when she saw that he was still calm and collected. Vivian, with a gentle smile on her face, walked over and glanced at Bryce, saying, "Bryce, I thought you didn't like this kind of soiree." Bryce did not deny it. He merely replied in an indifferent tone. He didn't reveal any expression on his face. She then turned to look at Natalie and greeted her with a smile, then said, "What a coincidence. We meet again, Natalie." Her gaze fell on Natalie's arm, which was linked with Bryce's. A hint of jealousy flashed through her eyes, but she suppressed it. Natalie caught her look of jealousy clearly, but she just replied with a smile and said, "Yes, what a coincidence." Noticing the undercurrent, Samuel quickly pulled Bryce aside, whispering urgently, "Bryce, why did you bring Natalie? You knew Vivian was going to be here." Bryce looked back at him candidly and said, "Why shouldn't I bring my wife with me?" Samuel was speechless. When he recovered himself, he could only sigh and say, "I was just worried that Vivian would be unhappy." Bryce said, "Well, what are you waiting for? You can go and comfort her now." With that, he turned around and left to find Natalie. Vivian was chatting with Natalie, looking extremely friendly. She said to Natalie, "Bryce rarely takes other female companions out. He only took me, one of his oldest friends, out once in the past. So I'm rather surprised that he has brought you here today." She surreptitiously observed Natalie's expression. She had always suspected that Natalie wasn't a distant relative of Bryce, and she wanted to get the truth out of her. Natalie replied faintly, "We just happened to meet here." She had guessed Vivian's intentions, and she dared not make any unnecessary expressions that might give something away. She faced the whole process calmly. Vivian wasn't satisfied. She was about to ask something else when she saw Bryce walk over. She said, "Bryce, you came back. I was just looking for you. There's some lovely red wine over there, a vintage that you like. Do you want to come over there with me and taste it?" Natalie looked away, not caring about this at all. Bryce rejected her, saying, "I still have things to do today. You and Samuel can go get a drink together. I'll be leaving soon anyway." He saw that Natalie was puzzled and looked at her, saying, "Aren't you coming with me?" Natalie nodded and followed him as he walked away from Vivian into the depths of the crowd. Vivian had wanted to talk to him more, but he had already left with Natalie. She watched the two of them disappear into the distance. For some reason, the more she looked at them, the more intimate they seemed. Samuel couldn't stand it any longer and asked her, "Vivian, why don't we go and have a drink?" She said curtly, "No thanks, go by yourself." Then she left, leaving him alone. A hint of disappointment flashed across his eyes. He lifted his glass of red wine and finished it in one gulp. The main thing Bryce had wanted to do at the gala was introduce Natalie to a lot of people, and that's what he was doing now. There were a lot of investors and producers. After a while, Natalie felt that she had gained quite a lot of contacts. Bryce had done this part by introducing Natalie to influential people. Now the onus was on her to leverage the contacts she had gained to boost Tony's career and that of her own. While her career soars, new problems for her personal life seemed to be lurking in the shadows. Vivian was digging for truths. Will she create trouble for Natalie when she learns them? Natalie's feet were starting to get tired. Her high heels were badly worn, and she was struggling to stand steadily on them. The soles of her feet were sore. She grimaced. Seeing her expression, Bryce asked her, "What's wrong?" in a concerned tone. She explained, and Bryce led her over to a seat in the corner. He said, "You take a rest. I'll go get a medical kit." Before she could refuse, he had already called for someone to send him a medical kit. When the kit was brought over, she was still sitting on the chair. She was about to get up and take the medicine kit when he stopped her. He squatted down and took off her high heels. Only then did he realize that her feet were swollen and red. Some parts of her foot soles were grazed. Holding her ankle, he slowly applied ointment to her wounds. His actions were very gentle, but his words were harsh. "Can't you take even a little care of yourself?" Natalie bit her lip. Her ankle was a sensitive part of her body. Having it touched by a man made her feel a bit uncomfortable, and she didn't dare to look at Bryce's face. Vivian, who was not far away, came closer and saw this scene. Her eyes shone with intense jealousy. She was even more certain that Natalie and Bryce weren't related to each other in the way that they had claimed. There had to be something between them, and she had to find out what. Just as he finished applying the ointment, Bryce's phone rang. He looked at Natalie and said, "I'll be right back. You can rest here for a bit while I take this call." She nodded and continued to sit in the chair, the embarrassed warmth on her face still lingering. Then she caught sight of Shirley Ross from Kara and saw her chatting with some producers, so she got up to say hello. But just as she got up, someone bumped into her. Wine spilled all over her clothes. She looked up in displeasure at the culprit. She realized with surprise that the person who had spilled wine on her was a male celebrity, Billy Wicker. Although she had never seen him in person before, she could not be mistaken, because Billy was probably the most popular person in the entertainment industry right now. Billy saw the spilled wine and immediately apologized. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't do that on purpose." His face was filled with anxiety and guilt. She was slightly surprised. She used to think that Billy's on-screen image of gentleness and courtesy was deliberately constructed for the consumption of the outside world. But now that she was up close to him, she realized that this was genuinely his character. Natalie's expression softened and she waved her hand, saying, "It's fine, I'll just wipe it off." Billy quickly said to her, "I'm the one who stained this dress, so I'm the one who should clean it up for you. You can't wear this now. I'll get someone to bring you a new outfit." She didn't want to make things too difficult for him, so she said politely, "There's really no need. I'll go to the bathroom and clean it myself. I'm fine." But Billy insisted very seriously, "No way! You can't wear that dress anymore. Let me arrange a replacement." She felt that she could no longer refuse. She nodded and said, "All right." Billy arranged for his people to get a new dress, and when they brought it to Natalie, went into the bathroom while he waited outside. Not long after, Natalie emerged wearing the replacement dress, which was a good fit. He took the stained dress away from her and handed it to one of his assistants. He said seriously, "I'll have my people get this washed. I'll return it to you when it's done." Natalie couldn't help but laugh at his earnest attitude. She chuckled and said, "It's really nothing. I didn't take it to heart." However, he remained serious. "No, this is my fault. I should do this to put things right." Natalie said, "You really behave like you do on TV. You're very warm." Billy also laughed when he heard this. He said to Natalie gently, "I thought you didn't know who I was." He'd suspected this because she had refused his offer of help. Usually people would agree to whatever he wanted if they recognized him. Natalie laughed and said, "How could I not know you? You're the most popular person in the industry right now. If I didn't recognize you, I wouldn't really be worthy of being in the entertainment industry myself." When Billy heard that Natalie was in the industry, his interest was piqued. "Then I guess you must be a new person in town, right?" Natalie smiled and said, "I've been abroad for quite some time, but now I'm back. I'm Tony Bavel's agent and manager." Billy's spirit immediately rose. Recently, he knew Tony had become quite popular, and he had been paying Tony's media presence some attention. People said that Tony's new manager was a powerful character, and now he knew that she was beautiful too. Billy Wicker said admiringly, "So, you're Tony's manager. Natalie Davidson. You have quite a reputation." Natalie had really become popular in recent times, unknown to her. Whenever Tony was mentioned, everyone now thought of her too. She hadn't known that she had become slightly famous. If she hadn't heard it from Billy, she definitely wouldn't have believed it. Embarrassed, she modestly waved her hand. "People exaggerate." Billy didn't think so at all. He said to her seriously, "I think you're being too modest. You're so young, and yet you've boosted Tony's career to a great extent already. You're really amazing." His words were not meant to flatter her, but came from the bottom of his heart. She could only smile. While chatting with Billy, she gradually realized that he really was a very gentlemanly person, just as his on-screen persona suggested. None of it was faked. She felt reassured by the fact that there was such a genuine person as Billy in the entertainment industry. And it was nice that the two of them could chat like this. Suddenly, Natalie realized that they had been chatting for quite a while, and became worried that Bryce wouldn't be able to find her. Natalie smiled apologetically at Billy and said, "I'm sorry, but the person I came must be searching for me. I'll have to leave." Just as she was leaving, Billy suddenly called out to her, "Natalie, wait a moment." Natalie turned around and said, "Yes?" After a while, the chef brought over the first dish of their meal to Bryce, Natalie, Liam, and Mrs. Perkins. Natalie's leg was still troubling her, so she just sat there and started eating. Liam was also eating. He ate until his cheeks were full, but still he refused to stop. The food that chef had given him was really too delicious. Natalie said, "Liam, eat slowly. No one is going to fight with you for it." He replied, "Mommy, it's really delicious. It's even more delicious than what Mrs. Perkins cooks." He glanced at Mrs. Perkins mischievously. Mrs. Perkins laughed and pretended to be angry at him. "Liam, it seems like I dote on you for nothing." He immediately shook his head. He placed an exquisite portion of grilled chicken in front of Mrs. Perkins and said, "It's not like that. Your cooking has the taste of home." Seeing that Liam was so articulate and kind, Mrs. Perkins smiled. She wished she could hug him tightly. Bryce, who was watching them, also gave a rare, gentle smile. He found that ever since Natalie had come to live in the house, he had started to enjoy the family life, despite all the noise. He gently leaned back and sipped his wine. He looked very content. Natalie covertly glanced at Bryce and realized that he appeared to have let down all his defenses. He seemed more approachable. After a while, Bryce's phone rang. Seeing that it was Samuel, he frowned as he picked up and said, "What is it?" His tone was sharp. Samuel sounded hesitant as he lowered his voice and said, "I'm at the Clare family mansion gate right now. Vivian's with me." Bryce's face immediately darkened. "Who asked you to bring her here?" "I'm sorry, Bryce. I accidentally let it slip out that you were staying out at the mansion. As soon as she found that out, she wanted to come over. I couldn't dissuade her." His voice was filled with bitterness. Bryce gritted his teeth and said, "You really know how to cause me trouble." Then he hung up without waiting for Samuel to reply. Natalie noticed that Bryce's expression had changed and asked, "What's wrong?" He said, "I have something to take care of back at the mansion. Stay here with Liam and play." He didn't explain things any further before leaving the beach with a gloomy expression on his face. Natalie decided to ignore his sudden change in mood and continued to play with Liam. When Bryce arrived at the mansion's vestibule, Samuel and Vivian were sitting on the sofa waiting for him. Vivian stood up excitedly and said, "Bryce, you're finally here!" Her eyes were filled with her usual love light of admiration for Bryce. He looked particularly fit and healthy in his beach clothes. Bryce replied indifferently. He deliberately avoided Vivian's burning stare and walked directly towards Samuel. Samuel had felt upset when he saw Vivian's expression, but he didn't show it. Instead, he lowered his voice and asked, "Bryce, how come you're dressed so casually?" He knew that Bryce rarely wore casual clothes. "I was out on the beach in the sun for a while," he explained. Then he looked at Samuel and Vivian and asked, "So what are you two doing here today?" Samuel felt embarrassed and looked at Vivian. He noticed that she didn't seem uncomfortable as she said calmly, "I haven't seen Mrs. Perkins for a long time. Samuel and I both miss her, so we came over here to see her." She looked at Bryce with a gentle smile. She didn't want to leave Bryce for even a second. All three of them had grown up together, often overseen by Mrs. Perkins. Their relationships all went back a long way and were pretty close. Bryce answered plainly, saying, "Mrs. Perkins is not home today. It seems that you have come at the wrong time." Then he glared at Samuel, who was sitting on the sofa, with an obvious meaning in the glare. "If there's nothing else, you can leave." Samuel pretended he didn't see Bryce's sharp glare and said, "I guess Mrs. Perkins went to buy groceries, right? I haven't sampled her culinary skills for a long time. Seems like Vivi and I are blessed today. Mrs. Perkins can cook us a meal." Bryce's face turned sullen as he glowered at Samuel. He was extremely displeased. This friend of his was good in every way, but he really liked Vivian too much, and he let that attraction affect his judgment. Bryce was just about to send the two of them away when Mrs. Perkins came in with Liam. Vivian was shocked when she saw Liam. She pointed at him and blurted out, "Why is he here?" Mrs. Perkins was a little surprised to see Vivian and Samuel, but she smiled as she greeted her old friends. The relationship of friendship cuts across the usual divides between employers and employees, master and servants. But seeing how animated Vivian was, Mrs. Perkins gave a troubled look at Bryce. She really didn't know how to respond to Vivian's outburst about Liam and wanted Bryce to step in and answer her question. Was this the end of the road for all the lies that Bryce had told? How will Vivian react when the truth about Bryce and Natalie's relationship comes out in the open?
Dear listener, the upcoming episode will be today's last free episode of this story. Come back tomorrow to enjoy free episodes or get coins now to continue listening.
Tomorrow again. Oh.
The gala was drawing to a close. Some of the guests had started to leave in twos and threes. Bryce saw that Natalie was tired, so they left early. When she got home, Natalie was exhausted. She wished she could just lie down in the car and fall asleep. When the car stopped in the driveway of the mansion, Bryce noticed that Natalie hadn't made any move to get out. He looked at her and asked with raised eyebrows, "Are you waiting for me to carry you inside?" Natalie opened her eyes and glared at him. Then she roused herself and slipped out of the car. Bryce laughed as he followed her into the house. The driver watched him go, wondering since when did Mr. Clare laugh so much. It was as if he were a changed man somehow. Natalie first went to check on Liam. Seeing that he had fallen asleep, she went upstairs to take a shower. She had been tired all day, so she needed to take a refreshing shower and then sleep. Bryce went to his study to deal with some business matters. Natalie was used to Bryce's dedication to his work. It wasn't easy being a CEO. The bathroom was on the second floor. She knew that Bryce was in the study downstairs, so she didn't lock the door. She got into the shower stall and let the hot water wash over her. She finally started to feel better. Wearing high heels for the whole night had been a real chore. Halfway through the shower, she was about to grab her shower gel when her sore bare foot slipped and she fell to the floor. As she hit the marble floor, she cried out in pain. Bryce had just come out of his study and was about to go back to his room when he heard the cry from Natalie's room. He immediately ran over to check. Natalie was curled up on the marble tiles, holding her leg. When she noticed Bryce was there, she almost cried out, but Bryce covered her mouth quickly, saying, "Hush, don't wake your son, eh?" She didn't say anything. She covered her naked body as best she could with her arms. Her face was red as she glared at him and said, "Please don't look at me." He grabbed a towel and wrapped it around Natalie, deliberately averting his gaze. He asked hoarsely, "Can you walk?" She tried to move, but then the pain came. She frowned and groaned. "No, I can't walk." That fall had twisted her ankle. It had already started to turn red and swell. He squatted down to pick her up and then took her downstairs. After laying Natalie on the sofa, he turned around and left without saying anything else. She was about to comment on his coldness, but then she saw him return with a medical kit. He knelt beside her and took hold of her ankle. Natalie, who hadn't been expecting him to do that, gasped and said, "Careful! It's very tender." "All right," said Bryce in a low voice. "Don't move. I'll apply the medicine for you." There was a hint of hoarseness in his voice, as if he was deliberately suppressing something. Only he knew how awkward this was for him right now. Natalie, too, felt awkward. She was only wearing a towel, after all. She didn't like that he could see so much of her bare skin. It was already late at night. Bryce held Natalie's ankle and slowly dressed her injury. Her foot and ankle, which had been sore from wearing high heels all night, now looked extremely red and swollen. His movements were very gentle, but Natalie still cried out in pain. She said, "Oh, that hurts! Be more gentle." She let out a soft moan as she inwardly lamented why it hurt so much. She cursed herself for being so clumsy. He frowned and said, "Quiet, don't be such a baby." A complicated expression appeared in his eyes. She said, "Please." Bryce sighed and decided to ignore her. He quickly applied the ointment. Hearing the commotion downstairs, Mrs. Perkins had come down and saw Bryce kneeling down beside Natalie. She saw to her surprise that Mrs. Clare was wearing nothing but a towel. She was very startled. From her perspective, the postures of the two people were quite ambiguous. The tender look in Bryce's eyes and the bashful look on Mrs. Clare's face was enough to make one's imagination run wild. Mrs. Perkins didn't find it hard to guess what the two of them had just been doing before she came in. The moment Bryce finished applying medicine to Natalie's ankle, Mrs. Perkins came over with 2 cups of hot chocolate and put them on the table. She said gently, "It's late. Drinking this will help you sleep. You should get some rest." Seeing that the two of them were not moving, she looked at Bryce and said, "Mr. Clare, don't mind me talking too much." Then Mrs. Perkins said to Natalie, "Mrs. Clare, it's chilly. Make sure you don't catch a cold." Natalie nodded, feeling extremely embarrassed. She really wanted to find a hole to hide in. Mrs. Perkins' expression clearly showed that she had misunderstood what the two of them had been doing. Thinking about that, Natalie glared at Bryce with resentment, saying, "This is all your fault. How am I supposed to look at people in the eye from now on?" She was too embarrassed. She didn't know how she was going to face Mrs. Perkins the next day. In the cold light of day.
Dear listener, now playing the next audio series.
Ayoko niyan. Wala na. Tapos na bukas.
Ouch! A red handprint appeared.
Yan sa'yo. Tomorrow again. Bye-bye.